Welcome, everyone, to today's national online forum and what many believe is one of America's biggest, most neglected problems, which is state lotteries. I'm Les Burnell, National Director for Stop Predatory Gambling, and I will be moderating today's event, which is titled How States Experiment with Lotteries Has Failed and Why It Affects You. First, some very brief background about who Stop Predatory Gambling is and the work that we do. We're a 501c3 nonprofit that's based in Washington, D.C. We represent a national advocacy network of individuals and partner groups with members in all 50 states. And our members work to reveal the truth behind commercialized gambling operators to prevent more victims. So we're one of the most diverse organizations in the United States, one in which citizens of all political stripes and life circumstances from every corner of the country work side by side. And so for those of you in the audience, we just have a couple logistical items for you. One is this national online forum. It's one of a series of forums that we do about commercialized gambling operators, their business, and the impact they inflict on our citizens, our communities, and the nation as a whole. To improve the viewing quality of this forum, we ask that you please keep your cameras turned off and your microphones muted. And you are invited to ask questions throughout this event by posting them in the chat function and following the presentations from our speakers. We will have some question and answer, and we will draw from the questions in the chat. And lastly, if you're not aware of it, we are recording this webinar. And so very briefly, the reason why we wanted to hold this event today with the two speakers we have with us is because both of them, in their respective work, investigated the institution of state lotteries in America. And their work made it clear that some of the most serious problems America faces today are partially rooted in the truth that lotteries, which are a government program, have turned tens of millions of small earners who could be small savers into a nation of habitual gamblers. And it's also important to distinguish when we're talking about state lotteries, why this business is different than any other. And so what separates state lotteries and other forms of commercialized gambling from every other business, including other vices like alcohol and tobacco, is it's a form of consumer financial fraud. It's a big con, similar to price gouging and false advertising. And it results in life-changing financial losses for many, many citizens in our country. And by a con, we're saying the citizens are conned into thinking that they can win money on games that are designed to get them fleeced in the end. So if you go out and pay for a pizza, you buy a ticket to a sporting event, you buy a glass of wine, that's what you receive in return. In state lotteries and other forms of commercialized gambling, what you receive is a financial exchange that offers the lure that you might win money. But this financial exchange is mathematically stacked against you so that inevitably you lose your money in the end, especially if you keep gambling. Success only comes at someone else's expense. So all of this explains why commercialized gambling in our country, including state lotteries, they're illegal unless you run the gambling scheme in partnership with state government. And that's what makes it a big con. So to help us take a closer look at state lotteries today will be Sean Mussenden, who's the data editor of the Howard Center for Investigative Journalism, which is an investigative reporting unit at the University of Maryland, Philip Merrill College of Journalism. The outfit partners with early career journalists and veteran journalists at news organizations like the Associated Press, PBS NewsHour, and National Public Radio to produce deeply reported investigative stories. And that's exactly what they did when they looked at the state lottery system, because Sean is with us today because he was a key figure in the recent Howard Center series titled Mega Billions, The Great Lottery Wealth Transfer, which was an in-depth look at lotteries in nearly every state. And those of you, if you saw in any email we sent out, we posted a link to the Howard Center's work titled Mega Billions, The Great Lottery Wealth Transfer. So hopefully you have that at some point during the chat. If you don't have it, we'll try to get it posted again. But I consider that series the very best series of national investigative reporting on state lotteries that's been done in recent memory. So I really congratulate the Howard Center for their incredible project. And then joining Sean today will be our featured panelist, Dr. Jonathan Cohen. Jonathan is a program officer at the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and is the co-editor of All In, The Spread of Gambling in 20th Century United States. Jonathan received his PhD in history from the University of Virginia. His new book is why we're here today, and it's titled For a Dollar in a Dream, State Lotteries in Modern America, and it was recently published by Oxford University Press. I believe Jonathan's book, and I've read every lottery book that's produced over the last 25 years, okay? Every single one that's come out, every pretty much news article that's come out on this topic. I believe this is the most important book that's been written about the problem of state lotteries in my generation. And I think Jonathan's work on state lotteries, is quoted frequently in national media. He's become like the national expert on state lotteries. And just to kind of further evidence to his credibility and persuasiveness, just this past week, the New Yorker posted a remarkable review of his book, which is posted in the chat. And I strongly urge everyone involved who watches this webinar, either today or going forward, to read that story. So with that, Sean, I'll turn it over to you.
All right, thanks, Les. So yeah, I'm just going to give a little bit of an overview of our reporting and what we mean when we talk about the system of state lotteries, and then get to some questions for John about his book. So, right, so as Les mentioned, we recently published a pretty deeply reported examination of lotteries, a $98 billion system of state-sponsored gambling that is designed to finance government operations. And just a note about our role here as an investigative reporters, we're deeply interested in exploring the systems that finance government and the equity of those systems. And so we thought this was a worthy subject to devote time to. Our only interest here is providing the public with accurate information on key public policy issues. So we follow the money through the system, from players to private companies that profit from running lotteries to the government. And John and his deep understanding of the system was a very important contextual resource for us during our reporting. So I'm really excited to be able to have this conversation with him here today. Just a few basic facts from our reporting about what we mean when we talk about the lottery system, the state lottery system. So we're all operating from the same place. So lotteries, as John will get into, used to be rare, but they now exist in all but 5 states. They aren't in Alaska, Hawaii, Alabama, Nevada, or Utah, but there are pretty active lobbying efforts in some of these places to expand there. There's been a lot of media coverage in recent years of the expansion of sports betting and growth of casinos around the country. But the lottery system is very large and growing. Sales over the last 2 decades have doubled to just about $98 billion per year. In terms of their role in financing government, they provide about 1% on average of state budgets in states where lotteries exist. And mostly that's earmarked to education, but some states do it differently. Where does the money come from for this? It comes from players losing money. On average, for every dollar a lottery player spends, they're going to lose about 35 cents. So they'll get back 65, they'll lose 35 on average. State lotteries are also exempt from FTC rules around truth in advertising. And so often this sort of basic fact about how the system works is obscured. Mostly I think when people think of lotteries, they think about large jackpot drawings like Powerball, in part because of intense media coverage when the jackpots get large. But in truth, this system is not that. Those large jackpot games are about 10% of sales. 2/3 of all lottery sales are of instant scratch-off tickets, which range in price from $1 up to $25 and $50. In some cases, I think there may be a $100 ticket now. These are very carefully designed artifacts to maximize play. Who funds the system? So a national study that we cite in our work shows that the top 10% of lottery players account for 2/3 of sales. It's people who are playing a lot who are mostly funding this system. And the most frequent players tend to be composed of people from communities that are Black, lower income, or have lower levels of education, especially high school dropouts. There are about 200,000 stores in the US that sell lottery tickets, and our original research showed that stores are overrepresented in lower than average income communities. So in total, every year, players lose about 30 billion. 20 billion of that is going to fund government operations. The rest, about 10 billion, is going to people who are profiting from the system. These are multinational companies that run lotteries on behalf of the states, stores that sell tickets. This includes large convenience store chains like 7-Eleven, advertising and media companies, and even state administrators who oversee the process. So John, I'm going to bring you in here. And maybe you can just sort of set the stage for us here. We mentioned that lotteries are close to $100 billion system in terms of revenue. How do you think that compares to other sort of common things we might think of in the American commercial landscape?
Sure. And yeah, I'll say $98 billion sure sounds like a lot, but I think it sounds even more when you compare it to other products, both from government and elsewhere that are out there. So $98 billion, as of last year, Americans spent more on lottery tickets than on cigarettes, than on coffee, or even on smartphones. And as of last year, they actually spent more on lottery tickets than on video streaming services, books, concert tickets, and movie tickets combined. So Les sort of alluded to, you have a guaranteed, you know what you're buying when you buy a pizza or a movie ticket versus when you buy a lottery ticket. But people are, when you compare it to these sort of inherently similar entertainment products that people can choose to spend their money on, the lottery is just blowing all the other ones out of the water by comparison.
So, we talked a little bit in the setup about the degree to which heavy players and are mainly the people financing the system, and that those heavy players tend to be from lower income places. Are there reasons in your book that you, beyond that, have honed in on, sort of issues that you have with the system?
Yeah, well, I would say there's a long-running belief, and when I say long, I mean it's found in a 1976 Federal Gambling Commission report, and you see it all over the place, even in modern journalism today, that gambling is inevitable, and that it's sort of this irrepressible vice, and no matter what you're going to do, people are going to play. And to a degree, that's true. People gamble, and that's fine. They'd like to have a poker game at home, and I don't think there's anything wrong with that. But there's something different, and I argue something particularly historical about the modern popularity of lottery tickets today. And there's nothing inevitable, there's nothing inexorable about $98 billion of sales and people spending more on lottery tickets than on coffee. Which one journalist described to me as American religion. So if it's big, it's bigger than God, in that case. So I argue that lottery playing popularity, in addition to all the normal appeal that gambling might have for a lot of people, is a result in large part of declining opportunity in the American economy, and that as over the late 20th century, as I guess what we would call the American dream, as opportunities for the American dream declined, or as rising rates of insecurity of folks who no longer found themselves on firm financial footing, no longer able to attain the middle-class lifestyle that their parents had achieved. As that situation became increasingly precarious, folks, rather than sort of downgrade their expectations, they kept their hopes and their aspirations for a bigger life and a better life. They just changed how they pursued it. And, recent polls from 2006, from 2010 indicate the huge percentage of Americans, particularly, Sean, folks earning less than $25,000 a year, but even folks who make more money than that, who have staked their hopes for the future on lottery tickets, and who believe that a lottery offers their best path at a new life. So to answer your question, even if we ignore and put aside for a moment the regressivity of lottery tickets and the fact that it is poor people who play, it has become for so many Americans, rich and poor alike, but mostly poor certainly, and middle class, their best avenue, their perceived best avenue to a better life. I'm skeptical that any of these people are going to defy the 1 in 302 million odds to win the Mega Millions. But again, there is this perception that they have no chance through the traditional economy, and that the lottery really is their best shot.
Let me just ask a follow-up there on that one. So how do you get the sense that advertising around the lottery feeds into that dream idea you were just talking about?
Yeah. So lottery advertising, folks ask about advertising a lot, and it is absolutely a problem. But as a historian, I will say it is not as big of a problem as it used to be in some ways. In the 1980s and 1990s, the advertising was so much more preoccupied with promising players that they were going to win. With I think Les called it a con. I think at the time it was really, the advertising message was very dupe focused, was, oh, a win is just around the corner. If anyone is familiar with the 1994 Simpsons episode that opens with a lottery, they have opened with a fake commercial where 5 different people burst into the office, all declaring that they just won the lottery, as sort of a pillorying of what lottery advertising was like at the time. So that absolutely was a huge problem, and they moved away from it because basically lottery commissions realize that they can't keep promising people that they're going to win, and then they never do win, and then they're going to get frustrated and stop playing. So nowadays, advertising is a lot more focused on the good that lottery does, which Sean and Les, you each alluded to. It does not do nearly as much good as they claim it does, but as a way to mollify players and say, oh, you didn't win, but it's all right. The state of Massachusetts hits the jackpot every year because we take in $1 billion. So it's all right, you didn't win, Sean, your ticket struck out, but you still did some good for the public. The other side of it being that the hopes and dreams being hooked on the lottery, they don't need to sell that anymore. People have sort of already tethered their wagon, so to speak, to the lottery, and already decided that the lottery is how they're going to make it out. And the simplest and I think most effective lottery advertising that we have today requires very little work from lottery commissions. All it is, and these are ubiquitous in states that sell tickets, is a billboard on the side of the highway that says, tonight's Powerball is $450 million, or tonight's Mega Millions is $580 million, whatever the number may be. That is enough of an allure and an enticement that lotteries basically realize they don't need to promise people they're going to win. People will do that work on their own. They'll see that $500 million jackpot and say, oh, if I play, I'll probably win. I'm special. I'm destined to be rich. I'm chosen, whatever the case may be. So the advertising is pernicious, and it's predatory, and it's concentrated in certain parts and certain environments and certain communities, Sean, as you alluded to. But the message has changed. In some ways, it's changed for the better, and in many others, it's changed for the worse.
So you mentioned the advertising talking about how states are winning. Wonder if there's anything more you want to say about where the money is going. It's about 1%, right, of state budgets in most places. How is it being used?
Yeah. So I'll say it's used differently in every state. So it's a little bit tricky. And it's a little bit tricky in part because the lotteries have a reputation for funding education, but that reputation was really born from the fact that the first 2 state lotteries were education focused. Those were in New Hampshire and New York in 1963 and 1967. And then in the 1990s, as the South sort of entered the gambling economy, it tethered its lotteries also to education, and to specifically just college scholarships and pre-kindergarten. But in many parts of the country, lotteries do not fund education whatsoever, despite they have this reputation for doing so. But I will say directly to your question, Sean, there are a couple problems with the lottery, with the ways the lottery funding comes in. In a few states, and the ones that come to mind are California, Virginia, Illinois, Florida, New York, have all had this problem where for every dollar from the lottery that goes into the state's education fund, $1 from the education fund comes out and goes into the general appropriation. So the lottery money ends up supplanting rather than supplementing sort of standard appropriation for education. So education doesn't actually get any net benefit from lottery money. And that's honestly the best case scenario. The worst case scenario are states in the South that use lottery money regressively, meaning they give money to richer people disproportionately in the South through things like lottery-funded merit scholarships, which are paid for and paid into by poor and Black and Latino gamblers disproportionately, and disproportionately benefit richer white suburban students in many states to help them go to college. So the money, as you said, and as Les said, is certainly not what states tout it to be, just in terms of the size, but also in terms of the way the states use it, poses a whole other set of problems that just exacerbate the ways lotteries have an adverse effect on the American poor.
Okay, so a big part of your book, right, is tracing the story of how we got from the beginning, 50 years ago when there were no lotteries, real and modern lotteries, right, to today when it's pretty much everywhere. So walk us through that. How do you explain that sort of steady expansion over that 50-year period?
Yeah, so I'll say there are two factors that stick out. Well, really, three factors. So apologies for the list. The first, very quickly, is in the post-World War II period, states needed more money and voters didn't want to pay more taxes and didn't want to lose state services. So there needed to be some compromise for lawmakers of ways that new money could be found without raising taxes, and gambling was increasingly sort of an enticing option. The second point in there, just to trace the trajectory very, very quickly, is I argue that for all the denigration of lottery players as gamblers and wishful thinkers and, stupid people who don't understand the odds, I argue that these lawmakers and voters are just as prone to gambling and are just as wishful in their hopes that a lottery would solve their state's financial problems. But over time, just to walk through the story, those hopes changed. In the 1960s and 1970s, the hope was that a lottery would single-handedly fund an entire state budget. We would never, ever need taxes ever again because the lottery, folks in New Jersey hoped, would raise $300 million, $500 million a year. That was clearly delusional. But again, that's why these lawmakers, I argue, are just as prone to gambling and just as prone to wishful thinking as the lottery players are. So that sort of carried the day in the 1960s, 1970s. In the 1980s, they realized that math wasn't going to work out. So folks sort of moved their expectations down a step and said, oh, it's not going to fund the entire state budget. It's really just going to fund the education budget, or it's just going to fund the police budget, or it's just going to fund the public parks, sort of one specific public program. And we can get into this in more detail. And the New Yorker profile that Les mentioned sort of talks in great deal about this. But there was a company, a lottery ticket company, Scientific Games, that really pushed this message and that brought the lotteries to states, promising that a vote for the lottery was not a vote for gambling, it was a vote for education, or a vote against lotteries was not a vote against gambling, it was a vote against public parks, or whatever the case may be. So again, you see from how we went, even the span of just 10 years, from lotteries funding the entire state to lotteries funding a single budget item, when even that proved illusory and ineffective. In the 1990s, the lotteries were going to fund specific scholarships and pre-kindergarten programs. So if we weren't going to see the effect of the lottery funding at the state level, we weren't going to see it at the program level. You could see it in your house. Sean, you can send your kid to college for free because of the lottery money. And so we see this sort of distillation of lottery expectations have gotten smaller and smaller. But even every time, lawmakers and policymakers and voters are sort of deluded into thinking that it's going to solve their designated problem. So very quickly, that's my sort of 3-minute spiel of how we go from 5.7 million in sales in one state in 1964 to 98 billion in 45 states over the span of just 5 decades.
And, let me ask too, so what's your sense of how much that growth has been organic and how much has been driven by, you mentioned one company, Scientific Games. There are, of course, other players, not a ton, but other players in this space.
Literally and figuratively, yeah.
Right. What's your sense of whether this happened organically, whether it was lobbying driven, and whether that changed over time?
Sure. So in the early 1980s, and so my focus is where the states where Scientific Games sort of did its dirty work were in Iowa, in Missouri, in California, Oregon, and Arizona, and Colorado, and the District of Columbia. So all of those states needed a kick in the pants from Scientific Games effectively to get the lottery on the ballot. Once that happened, then it was sort of the floodgates were opened, and states sort of in some cases of their own accord, in some cases with additional lobbying help, but lotteries were sort of seen as inevitable by lawmakers at that point, with the exception of the 5 states you mentioned at the top. But it's really important to emphasize that as of 1977, lotteries were really confined in the Northeast and then the Rust Belt, and it is unclear without this company's intervention how long it might have taken, if ever, for lotteries to spread. Organic support, to borrow your word, does not by itself gather signatures and pay for advertising to convince people to pass a lottery, and doesn't write bills. It doesn't do any of these things, but this company did. So it sort of jump-started the spread of lotteries, and it led to organic growth from there. But again, it's sort of artificially organic, or grass or astroturf, as I've called it, in part because it required this jumpstart. And I would say a big factor here in terms of the organic growth is the neighbor state phenomenon, where if one state has a lottery, for example, in Georgia, the voters in South Carolina will easily reason that, everyone in South Carolina is already playing the lottery, but the money is going to benefit Georgia, and they will legalize it for themselves. That logic is pretty faulty. There are certainly, there were in the early 2000s, South Carolina gamblers who were going into Georgia to buy lottery tickets. But once you legalize it in South Carolina, you open it up to a whole set of players who live, not near the state border, who were not gambling in any sense. So that is the organic logic, I guess, that has driven policymakers as faulty and as misguided as it has been in many cases.
In recent years, there have been, I'm thinking of Mississippi, for example, some states that for a long time there had been a significant religious opposition among some lawmakers, and that has started to change. I'm just curious if you have a sense of sort of what might have tipped that in those places. Was it just the neighbor state phenomenon, or was it something else?
Well, I will say that what we saw in Mississippi, which is the most recent lottery joiner in 2018, was actually sort of fairly similar to what I see in New Hampshire in 1963 and in California in 1984. It's really the anti-lottery coalition in state after state, in every region of the country, has really been concentrated among Protestant churches or Protestant leaders, religious leaders within the state, in some cases with sort of state leadership involved as well. The arguments against the lottery in state after state are sometimes religious in nature, but often not. Often they're social arguments about the effect on the poor, about the effect on the work ethic, about increase in problem gambling that would come in from state lotteries. And unfortunately, over these objections that Protestants have raised for decades in these various states, voters, policymakers alike have sort of decided that their pocketbook is more important than these potentially moral and ethical objections. And if they're pursued the glittering gold of the lottery dollar over these sort of moral and ethical concerns that the religious communities in these states have tried to put front and center in the lottery debates. There have been, I will say, some successful cases. Alabama in 1998, one of the reasons it doesn't have a lottery was the churches there organized vehemently to defeat a lottery referendum in 1998. There have been a few other cases of lotteries being defeated in North Dakota in the late 80s, in Arkansas, I believe in 2003, but they are generally rare. And there is enough money behind the lottery industry that if they lose one ballot measure, they'll just come back the next year with another. So there has been strong religious opposition, sometimes well organized, sometimes not, that has done the best it can. But in many states, it's really a David and Goliath situation where the lottery industry is Goliath.
None of this system would work, right, if people weren't playing.
Right.
And I'm wondering what your book has to say about why these games became so popular, and they are popular, right?
Yeah. So there are three sort of major types of lottery games that are worth touching on, and I'm not going to go into detail on each. The first being daily numbers games, which are sort of happen daily, as I said, but in some states hourly, or every 20 minutes you can play a Keno game at your local convenience store. Those are sort of directly co-opted from illegal numbers games that were ubiquitous in urban Black communities in the early 20th century. Those were sort of just transposed onto the modern lottery system, and those account for 10, maybe 15% of lottery sales. So those are gamblers, those types of gamblers have been playing those types of games for almost 100 years. Then there are the lotto games. You mentioned the Powerball, the Mega Millions, the rollover, and those, I think, draw their appeal in large part from the size of the jackpot, and in particular from these problems around economic inequality. I don't think it's a coincidence that as the term billionaire enters the American lexicon, all of a sudden, as of 2016, the top lottery Powerball prize that sort of sets off a frenzy is $1 billion. And I think as the goalposts have gotten bigger for what it means to be rich in America, so too have the jackpots gotten bigger, and that is really what drives the popularity of those games. But the bread and butter, as you mentioned, of lottery sales are scratch tickets, which their appeal, to your question directly, is the instantaneous experience of playing, the instantaneous knowledge of being a winner, and in many cases, the prize curve. One lottery executive sort of explained to me that the shape of scratch ticket prizes is a U. There's a huge concentration at the very, very small dollar increments, and then a concentration at the very, very large dollar increments. And at the very small dollar increments, $2, $5, $10 prizes, a lot of that money just gets turned right back into tickets. And even at the store where people play, it just turned right around. And then obviously the bigger prizes appeal for many of the same reasons that Lotto does. That's sort of meant to be a life-changing wealth. But you're right. All this, these lawmakers wouldn't be so involved in lotteries if they weren't so profitable. And it's important to recognize and to think about, from my interviews with lottery players, both current and historical, why the games retain such a deep appeal for people today.
So yeah, let's get back to kind of where we are now. So your book, you've done all this research. At the end of it, you come to this conclusion that lotteries should not exist in the modern United States. There are obviously a lot of people who disagree with you, including players and a lot of lawmakers in states where these things work, and some of the beneficiaries of the programs. So I guess what I'd like to know is what persuaded you to arrive at that conclusion, and whether there's any counter evidence that, in the back of your mind is like, well, maybe there is some argument for them.
Yeah. So I'll, as a disclaimer, I'm a historian, I'm a PhD. I didn't come into this topic with any bone to pick, I barely had sort of a preconceived notion about what the lottery was beyond, clearly this is a big issue in a lot of people and relates to questions of opportunity and inequality. I had no sort of preconceived idea of, I'm going to really stick it to the lottery industry with this one. I tried to be sort of fair in my assessment, and to weigh the evidence and present the evidence in my book, as you said, both for and against the industry. I think the case for the lotteries would simply be how much money they raise for states. Put aside the percentage and the scale and all these adverse beliefs they instill in people about how the lottery, how much money it raises. It raises a lot of money for states. Last I checked was something like $52 billion over the course of the last 50 plus years. Great. So be it. That's important. And I think that's really the best case you can make for lotteries. The case against lotteries that I've sort of assembled, it relates to many things we've touched upon about how many people have sort of invested their hopes and future in it, how it encourages the state to treat people as gamblers rather than as citizens, how it deludes people into thinking that the education budget or other items in the budget are accounted for by gambling when they are in fact very much not. There is a lot of, I'll keep going, the rise of problem gambling that states facilitate, the treatment of poor and non-white communities by lottery retailers that have sort of become ubiquitous in those communities. I think all of those speak to, or led me to the conclusion that lotteries should not exist in the United States today.
So the people in a position to make decisions about whether they should exist or not exist, the state lawmakers in most states, either disagree with you or don't think it's important enough to speak up and do something about it, right? So what's your sense for why that is? Why is there little appetite for changing the system?
Yeah. Well, I can answer that in one word, and I think that's money. If you need a longer answer, the lottery lawmakers have the same problems today that they did 50 years ago or 40 years ago when these lotteries were passed. They have citizens who don't want to pay more taxes, and they don't want to be seen as the ones cutting Social Security or Medicare or some other public benefit. And the lottery raises, quote unquote, free money. And the reason it is free, and the reason that lawmakers are willing to overlook where lottery money comes from, and the reason they don't look too closely and they don't want to look too closely is because of who is playing the lottery. The fact that it is disproportionately people of color, lower income, less educated communities makes it really easy for lawmakers to discard and just not even question the source of the lottery funds. Excuse me. It's commonly understood by this point. It was pretty well understood in the late 80s, and it's really well understood now by even people who don't know anything about lotteries, that they prey on the poor and that the poor are the people buying into them. And the only reason that lawmakers, the only excuse they could possibly give for the fact for why lotteries are still exist is because they don't care. It can't be that they don't know, because if they looked at the data, it'd be screaming them in the face. It must be because they don't care. Or they would say, oh, surely if New Hampshire got rid of its lottery, then everyone would just go to Vermont and play. That's true, but it's what message does it say about how New Hampshire treats its citizens and how the state views its people? The fact that New Hampshire continues to have a lottery would be my question. But that is what explains sort of why lotteries continue to exist and why they are no longer sort of in the spotlight as a public policy issue for lawmakers as they were in the 1980s and 1990s when the industry was getting big.
Okay, thanks. So I see we've got a lot of questions in piling up in the chat. So Les, I think you were gonna open it up to the audience. So I will mute myself.
Great. Well, that was excellent. Thank you, Sean. So I have kind of a couple of questions to kick it off here, and then I thought it was really, John, that was a really great conversation thus far. So let's keep this rolling. There's one thing I want to really, on my end, Jonathan, I want to ask you, and that is, and it's kind of been understated, it's kind of underlying this conversation a little bit, but in a day and age where we're having these huge national debates around how do we improve opportunity for everyday citizens, right? You have the federal government just forgave all these student loans during the economic, during COVID. We send out stimulus checks everywhere to help people get ahead and to stay afloat. Yet state lotteries, everything else that state government was closed during COVID, that state lotteries were still running, and states had record sales during those periods. So here you have like these major social problems that our country is facing our major economic problems. Yet no one, you're like one of you guys, and I think the Howard Center did this as well, to their credit. Like, you guys made the connection that state lotteries are part of this. Many of these problems are rooted in state lotteries, that the reason why we have wealth inequality in part is because of the existence of state lotteries in poor communities across this country. So my question to you is, why do the major political constituencies in our country, forget lawmakers for a second, lawmakers respond to the public, but like, if you looked at the top so-called progressive groups in the country, and if you looked at the top conservative groups in the country who say they care about wealth inequality, who say they care about systemic racism, who say they care about small government, like none of them would have, state lotteries, which arguably are should be front and center in all those debates as part of their agenda. And so how does that change? So forget lawmakers. How do you get these major constituency groups in this country to begin having a conversation from the right and the left to recognize this is a problem. Lawmakers will respond to that. So it's kind of a big question. I just want to throw that out to you to kind of, because that's where the heart of this is. How do those groups weigh in on this?
Yeah,
and why don't they?
I think that is the question, and I will say it's almost in some cases worse than what you outlined, in that new politicians coming up, in order to propose expensive programs, will sort of rely on casino gambling or lottery revenue as like, oh, this is what we can use to fund my new idea for fixing up the Baltimore Harbor, or whatever the case may be, is, oh, we can use casino revenue for that. So we're sort of have this new generation of politicians who, again, are so tax averse or so scared of being seen as people who are going to raise taxes, that they have no choice but to sort of triple down, pun intended, on the gambling economy. In terms of how to activate and how to sort of get folks interested, it's a really good question, and one that I think speaks to presenting evidence about the way that the lottery is sort of a lived and daily part of so many Americans' lives. And it is so easy to overlook. And I can't overstate how many people I talk to from my personal life, from an upper middle class, suburb of Boston, who don't know anything about the lottery, who never think about it, who maybe think about it when the jackpot gets big, but they don't realize they have to pay cash. They don't know where their nearest lottery outlet is. And I would say, as someone, as again, a historian and not an advocate and not a lobbyist by any sense, but getting folks like that who are voters, as you say, Les, who care on both right and left about issues of social inequality, and at the very least certainly care about restoring the American dream and giving people the chance to succeed and creating opportunity, letting them realize how pernicious this system that they totally overlook has become, and how large it looms in the sort of social psyche of millions and millions of poor Americans. I don't know how to go beyond that, but I think that would be a good starting point to at least raise the profile of lotteries as a national issue that is tied exactly into this economic question that you've raised.
Thank you. And well said. And that's what we describe this as America's biggest, most neglected problem. Like, it's just thoughtful people they don't get it. There's just a huge disconnect there.
And I'm reading a book by Beth Macy called Dope Sick, and I think a helpful parallel would be something like the opioid crisis, where I had a chance to talk to the former domestic policy director for Mitt Romney's 2012 presidential campaign, and he said someone asked him in New Hampshire about the opioid crisis, and he had no idea what they were talking about. He had to Google opioid, like opium. He thought they were talking about 19th century China. So. And then within 10 years later, now the opioid crisis is a nationally recognized and understood problem. And I think with sort of the trajectory, if I'm being optimistic, is that the gambling issue becomes sort of what happens to gambling is what happened to the opioid crisis, where it goes from being a grassroots problem that everyone at the grassroots knows about, but that does not penetrate the national media, and the profile gets raised, and there are hearings and investigations and real inquiry and thought devoted to how to fix the problem that has gone unaddressed for many years.
Sure. So the next question, Jonathan, goes to which you stated as kind of the, beside all the problems with the lotteries, the reason why they still exist. You argue you said one word, it's money. But let's focus on that, because when you really, and I know your book kind of touches on this, and I know people like Lucy Dedayan at the Urban Institute has done great work looking at the revenues that states receive from commercialized gambling. But isn't it true, really, at the end of the day, like this, even though the state may make, X amount of dollars, in the long term, this is a budget gimmick. It costs the states more, doesn't it, to run these gambling games than it actually brings in? Because, as we mentioned earlier, states had record lottery sales during COVID, when everything else was closed. Here we have taxpayer dollars being spent, that people are borrowing is money to give taxpayers money to help them stay afloat during this period. Yet state lotteries were taking a bulk of that wealth. So it's just this huge cycle of wealth. And the St. Louis, the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis has talked about this, that it's just like it's a budget gimmick. The only people really winners here on the revenue side are really the gambling companies. So I wonder if you can just flesh out, is it really even an effective revenue source? Is that that's why we call this a failed experiment. Hasn't it failed as a revenue source?
Yeah, and what you're alluding to, and I can't speak for it, not having conducted the study or looked into it that closely, but there are some indications that, especially for a smaller state that has a lottery, that lottery or legalized gambling is a net negative in terms of profitability. Again, I can't speak to this nationally. I can't speak to it in every state, but the indications would be that in a state like Wyoming, just for example, because of its size, that the lottery brings in so little money because there's such a small player base, and the cost of a single person with problem gambling, both to the state or their community or their family, is so high, especially if many white collar problem gamblers get quickly involved in things like embezzlement and fraud, that the cost to the state is so high that, again, the indications would be that potentially legalized gambling is in fact a net negative in some places. So again, I can't speak to that nationally or in every state, but certainly what you're describing when in terms of COVID is certainly a robbing Peter to pay Paul situation. And I cite an amazing study from the Houston Chronicle from 2020 that lottery sales declined rapidly in March 2020 as things were sort of being shut down and as folks were working from home, but that sales went right back to where they were in March and April, in April and May, as families started receiving their first round of COVID relief checks from the government, which again, money from the federal government into the state government, 60% of it, as Sean outlined, sort of going into prizes, going into prizes in players' pockets, 35% going to the state. And then, as you mentioned, Les, that always important 10 to 15% cut for the stores that sell tickets, companies like 7-Eleven, and then for companies like Scientific Games that print the tickets. I know, Sean, this was a major focus of the Howard Center centers. I'm curious what you think.
Yeah, I'll just say, I think the evidence state by state shows that in smaller states, the cost of running the games is higher because it doesn't scale as well, but that, the games are still bringing in more money to the state than it costs to run them. I think otherwise they, wouldn't do them. But that's not factoring the externalities I think you're talking about, Les, which is should the the profit margin for the state, should another cost be dealing with any problems that are associated with it, right? I think that's what you're getting at.
Yeah, and we know it does. I mean, it's in poor communities across the country, you have people making minimum wage in states like Texas, make $7.25 an hour in these poor neighborhoods, and state government is selling in Texas is selling $100 scratch ticket in these same communities. You have to work 2 days at minimum wage in Texas before you can lose it in 5 seconds to a $100 scratch ticket, courtesy of state government. So Sean, we have a question for you that come in and as obviously not speaking for all media here, but I think with the Howard Center series was so remarkable and so refreshing, just such great investigative reporting on state lotteries from a national perspective. But can we agree though that part of the reason why we talk about how lotteries have spread and we blame a lot on lawmakers and these corrupt gambling companies, and certainly that's a huge part of it. But in some ways, aren't some members of the media, or at least media companies, somewhat complicit in this because they don't report on all when we have a $1 billion jackpot, or when they show the photograph of somebody winning a $50 scratch ticket, they win a $1 million prize at the state's $50 scratch ticket game. I mean, tens of thousands of citizens had to lose, millions and millions of dollars for that $1 million, to be won off that scratch ticket. So the media just shows that one side of it. So how does this conversation? Part of this conversation has to be, how does the media start looking at this in a way like it would more aggressively than it has historically, because they have been complicit in many ways.
The time, the cost, people, money it takes to do this kind of deep dive is it's expensive. It costs a lot of money to do this, right? And the stories about the jackpot are easy and people get excited, and it's easy to go out, send a TV camera out to a convenience store and interview people as they're standing in line. I haven't studied this. I don't know that anybody studied this. Maybe John knows if anybody studied this, but anecdotally, the amount of coverage that takes more of a system look than a one-off jackpot look is, off by many hundreds of times, I'm sure. I was heartened after we published this. I got calls from a number of local TV stations and places that are typically doing these kinds of, hey, the Powerball just hit $1 billion. Let's talk about how excited everybody is. Wanting to do, hey, is there a way we can localize this? Can we look at what's happening in our state? So I don't know if there's any media folks on this call. I would be happy to work with you all to look and see what's happening locally. But it's part of the air. It's just what media organizations do when there's a big jackpot, and I think it's hard to get people to turn that around.
And Les, I'll just say, just from an impact perspective, I think we should just treat those kinds of puff piece stories as in-kind contributions. Basically just free advertising for lotteries that we discussed earlier, and that's been going on for a long time. But it's more effective. A story of someone from your community, your town, your state winning the lottery is as effective as 1,000 lottery advertisements, because it's here's just the way psychology works, and I'm drawing on the work of behavioral psychologists from as far back as the 70s, is that once you believe that something improbable can happen, you are sort of inclined to believe it will. And once you see an example of someone like you for whom something like this happens, you're gonna believe that your turn is next.
Okay. That's why you'll see a big advertising strategy, right? Is this store had $100,000 winner, like banners that go up, and those are pretty effective.
Right.
So again, I think this is important for everyone who is viewing this online forum, and I think anyone who's been involved with our organization is well aware. Like this problem. This is both political parties are culpable for what's happened here, and so this question is kind of with knowing that context. This question is not said in this partisan way that I think it was positioned in the chat, but I just want to give that preface to make sure this is not, we're not leaning one way or the other here, but there is, to specifically focus for a second though, on the American left. The question is, why has the American left particularly been so silent on this issue? You have people who are hammering this, all these other social justice issues, racism and so on. I know we touched on this a little bit earlier, but just, I think we need to dig, the question needs to dig in a little bit deeper about, what's it going to take to flip the American left on this issue so that they see predatory gambling as like they see, like they fight for a higher minimum wage and other economic and social justice issues.
Yeah, I certainly think, I would hope, and I'm just looking at the original version of the question, that raising the profile of gambling as an issue would bring it to the attention of folks. If you look back in the 1980s, in 1984, there was a dedicated U.S. Senate hearing organized by Minnesota Senator David Durenberger about state lotteries, where he expressed a lot of concern that the industry had gotten out of control. And that was sort of the peak, I think, of exactly what you're describing, Les. And they were all over it at the time, the American left was, about the problems with state-run gambling. In terms of why that attention has waned, I think a couple decades of being screamed at over being tax and spend liberals, probably doesn't help, and doesn't help the sort of the appetite for liberal politicians to find any means of raising money that they can that is not a tax. But I would hope that the silence is not a matter of implicit support for the lottery industry, but is in fact, a prioritization of things like student loans, whereas sort of raising the profile, or if there was a sort of I think Sean was right, sort of the local dimension, if we could build out from there, if there's not going to be, but if there was ever a proposal for a casino in Vermont, I would hope that would sort of spark Bernie Sanders' interest, or him to speak out, for example, against the commercialized gambling industry, as one of the many industries that the left has dealt with, about preying on the poor. But I don't know exactly why this has sort of escaped their attention for so long, and I hope that it does not for much longer.
Okay. Thank you. So this next question is somewhat specific, relates to higher education, and I just wonder, do you see, the gentleman raised the question, how much of today's crisis with higher education costs, like student loans and high tuitions and so on, do you see any kind of connection to that problem to the role of state-run gambling, becoming pernicious? Do you see any
Interesting.
connection there?
Yeah. Interesting. I haven't looked into this, and thankfully I'm not an economist. I have not looked into whether lottery funded scholarships in southern states have had an inflationary effect on tuition prices. But you can imagine that they would. The problem being that the Hope Scholarship, as it's called in Georgia and Tennessee and other states, it promises first year or 2 years or multiple years of free college tuition. And if the lottery, if the tuition keeps going up, that's just money that the lottery is going to have to cover. So I don't know particularly, but I would say this is a uniquely concentrated problem higher education wise in the South, in Florida, Arkansas, Georgia, South Carolina, Louisiana, other states that have used lottery money specifically towards college scholarships. And I will say, as an important caveat, that it is not 100% of the lottery dollar in these states that is going to these scholarships. It is often also tied to pre-kindergarten programs. So I can't speak specifically to the inflationary nature of higher education. Certainly, it has changed the scope of sort of who is able to access top public universities in the country. It has, since the 1990s, crowded out, ironically, poor Black students, and sort of concentrated them into in-state schools that are either lower tier, and made room for these richer white suburban students instead, who are sort of going to college free, thanks to lottery money.
Thank you. So this next question is kind of specifically in terms of how going forward, what kind of data exists to make that case that how lottery spending affects other types of spending, as well as kind of the corresponding tax losses that would occur, say in your sales tax. If you're a state that has a sales tax, people spending money in the lottery, they're not buying, other services that would, I know on casino stuff, we've seen some of those studies. I'm just wondering if you have a sense of, maybe more recently, has anyone looked at those types of data points? And if not, like, can you see a pathway for people to, is there opportunity for people to make those kinds of investments in new research? Like, can you see a way? Can that be studied?
Yeah.
Track that.
Yeah. And so I think that, and I think that's the future, honestly, or that's the best case, or one of the best ways to sort of get us out of this lottery morass, which is lotteries are so effective at this point in advertising all the good that they do. And the way to sort of chop them out at the knees, so to speak, would be to put that number in context, and to, it's a picture of a graph, and here's the sliver, the tiniest sliver of a sliver that comes from lottery money. And that would, I think, wake a lot of legislators up to how small of a proportion it is, and that they're not as reliant on it certainly as they think they are. And I would hope that they are sort of willing to reinvestigate the costs, the literal cost for millions of people of getting all of that money. So I think that is an effective strategy. And frankly, a lot of that data, the Howard Center collected it, but it doesn't take an awesome organization of dedicated students like the Howard Center to collect it, in part because these are government agencies and are required to disclose their funding. And, I'm sure students at UMD are better equipped than most of us to file a FOIA request and to get data from governments that they don't publish online. But a lot of it is published online. And with a couple hours, any Joe Schmo with a laptop and an Excel document can pull up all 45 state lotteries and see exactly what share, where the money goes and how much money they raised, and what percentage of the state revenue comes from that lottery money. So I think that's all relatively available, and it takes organizations like the Howard Center to put those numbers into context and to sort of build narratives around those stories that make them compelling, and that would help them have impact among lawmakers and among the broader public.
Good. Thank you.
Yeah.
And so kind of related question, and maybe this is, Jonathan, I know this may be more geared to the work that Sean does, but the question is, how can a citizen, if you're a citizen activist in a state, how do you get some of the data you referenced here, like, this gentleman references Tennessee, but regardless of where you live, like, where can you get access to your state's data on route lotteries? to really, make these types of cases? Like, what tips would you have for advocates, at least in terms of compiling data state by state?
So, I'll just say, John mentioned some of them. A lot of this is very publicly available on their websites. You can download annual reports, which have a lot of it. One kind of challenge is that the accounting around this is a little bit weird, and to really understand how much money's coming in and how much money's going out, you have to kind of dig in pretty closely. Public records laws in your state too will, for example, as part of our work and looking where lottery retailers are located and who the customers of those stores are, we filed FOIA requests to pretty much every state. These are public records laws. You just send a request to the lottery, they send it to you, they send us back detailed sales data that we used in our reporting. I don't know, Skip, who asked this question. If you live in Tennessee, Tennessee is one of these weird states where you actually have to live there to ask for these kind of documents. But pretty much everywhere else you can get it, even if you're out of state.
And I will say something that the Howard Center got that I didn't have, that was awesome, and that you're only ever going to get by filing a public records request is local data. Data down to the county level or the zip code level. That's not going to be available online, and that's obviously crucial if you want to do any mapping to see exactly where the lottery money comes from and which communities are playing. That's data that the Howard Center got for many states, if I remember correctly.
Yep.
But it is not something that you could just go pull up the lottery website and grab for yourself.
Let me add one thing too. I don't know if anybody on the call is from Georgia and would be interested in getting the sales data. Georgia's public records law actually says the lottery gets to decide what it wants to make public and what it doesn't. So we couldn't get sales data from Georgia, for example, but we were able to pull from their website the locations of all these stores. So some places will make it hard for you. Some places will make it easy. Just got to try.
I guess more specifically, do you have, he's asking, do you have specific data for Tennessee in your reporting, Sean, at all?
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
We do. And I'll just drop my email in here.
Thank you.
And if you want to reach out to me, I'd be happy to point you to that.
All right. Again, if you have a question, and even in the audience, you're welcome to post it in the chat here. A couple more here. We're going to try to wind down about 10 minutes here. And this has been really good stuff, Sean and Jonathan. We appreciate your insights on this stuff. I know I like to think I know a decent amount about this issue, but I'm learning an enormous amount today. And
you do all right, Les. You do all right.
All right.
Yeah.
So let's get to this one. This is a gentleman from California who's asking. He goes, I'll kind of paraphrase the question, so while your vision, Jonathan, in the long term may be that lotteries in the 21st century should no longer exist. They really haven't fulfilled their purpose. They haven't delivered. They've kind of been a failed experiment. But in the short term, so long term, obviously that can be the goal. But in the short term, can you suggest some very specific things that could be done for activists at state levels to make a difference on this, to really start moving, reform forward on this? And related, can you think of other countries that do this, run lotteries in a more just way, or, in a less predatory way? Let's put it that way.
Sure. So I can think of 4 off the top of my head, sort of smaller levers that don't require, getting rid of the lottery. How about this? 5. I can think of 5 ideas off the top of my head of sort of smaller levers that people, of things that folks can advocate for that would be helpful and impactful, and that don't require the sort of dream answer of getting rid of the lottery entirely on their own. I'll run through them very quickly. One, Sean mentioned at the top, would be advocating for federal truth and advertising laws to apply to lotteries, and closing a loophole that has existed. Whatever, we don't need to get into the history, since the 1960s, and it is extremely pernicious. The second would be the banning of online lottery sales, and the transition that is already happening in many states, already underway in others, and completed in some, to move lottery tickets online, mostly to appeal to younger generations who are not gambling to the degree that their parents and their older siblings are. Another would be prize caps, which again were pretty standard in the mid 1980s. Lotto cannot get above $50 million. Once it hits $50 million, it stays there. That I think would be nice and impactful. Another would be limiting the price point of scratch tickets. You can't sell a scratch ticket more than $20, let's say. And another one, a final one, would be the tenor and focus of advertising, putting aside the truth in advertising question for a second, but just what exactly the tone and the content of those advertising messages can be. So all of those can come at the state level, well, except for the truth in advertising law. 4 of those can come at the state level. It can be local. Some of them have a strong precedent, either in recent history or sort of currently on the books and are just not enforced. But I hope that those are sort of easier and more attainable goals for folks as they engage in their advocacy work.
Can I mention something too, Les? And I want to be careful on my end to frame this as I'm not advocating for people to go out and do this, but that this was a bit of information that in my reporting I was looking for and was hoping that state lotteries would produce, that I was consistently not able to find. And that is a detailed breakdown of how much money is spent by the average player. Nationally, we've seen some surveys that show like the top 10% of players account for like 2/3 of sales, right? Having that information for each state, understanding in detailed crosstabs what the racial, economic, educational makeup of those groups are, I think would be really useful. We ask for this kind of information and these kinds of breakdowns and marketing plans from nearly every state. And I think we only really got something close to that from 2. Wow. And only 1, Texas, really I think was mandated by law to produce this information and provide it to legislators. And my interest as a journalist is advocacy for more detailed information, and that's something I would hope that someday lotteries were regularly producing.
Sure. And did you happen to post some of your original FOIA, the stuff that you gathered from FOIAs? Did you guys post that at all anywhere, like on a database?
We posted some of it, and I'm still working on prepping it for wider public release.
That'd be great. I mean, because no one's done that. Even just posting, because some of those original documents you guys got back from them would be really, in terms of other journalists, it would just whet the appetite for other really good journalists out there to, they wouldn't be starting from scratch.
Yeah, the marketing studies and the advertising plans
that's good stuff.
Were really, really quite interesting.
And I'll just add quickly to Sean's point that there is a long-standing statistical sleight of hand performed by lottery commissions when with the data that they do release. They'll say, oh, everyone who won, this is the demographic breakdown of people who won more than $2,000, for example, which you say, oh, of course, everyone who winning the lottery is random, so it should be representative of the people who played the lottery, except that by starting the prize point at $2,000 or sometimes it's $600, whatever the case may be, you leave off the poorer players who are buying the $1 scratch tickets and who are playing the daily numbers, which is disproportionately popular among poor and Black players. So it looks like it's a representative sample whenever you see a sort of the demographic breakdown of winners, but it is in fact skewed and pre-selected by the lottery commission. So that's why the data that Sean is advocating for would be so valuable. And I think one of the reasons it is so hard to find is because state lotteries probably know what's in there and don't want to share it.
Yeah, and let me just add to that. One thing we also commonly saw in a lot of reports is the percentage of people from each demographic group who play. And what that does is it treats somebody who plays the lottery once a year, buys a scratch-off ticket once a year, as somebody who plays 10 times a week.
That's right.
And those are very different things, right, in terms of who's funding the lottery. So, and
lotteries do that on purpose. I mean, that's a willful decision to skew those numbers. That's a really important point, Sean. Thank you for mentioning that. Well, our goal was to keep this to an hour and 15 minutes. So before, I'm going to invite Sean and Jonathan to share a final thought. But before I do that, I need to do a couple of things. One is I want to briefly recognize the work of 2 of my colleagues who are on today's online forum that have been helping us with this event. We have Eric Stamps, our digital communications director, and Kate Rossi, our development director for Stop Predatory Gambling. So thank you both for the work you do. And I also want to mention in terms of where our organization's funding comes from, in terms of who funds these types of events. So Stop Predatory Gambling is a 501c3 charity. And our funding comes from the selfless giving of every one of our national board members. It comes from individual donations from hundreds of concerned citizens, as well as people with the lived experience of predatory gambling from across the United States. And it also includes some gifts from a few smaller foundations. So we're grateful to them, to all of them, to funding this type of work. And lastly, if you're not a member of Stop Predatory Gambling, I strongly urge you to learn more about what we do and to get involved in this fight to reveal the truth about commercialized gambling operators to prevent more victims. And you can learn this by visiting our website at stoppredatorygambling.org and join us. So with that, I'd like to, Jonathan, I'm going to give you the final word. So I'll invite Sean first to say, if you have any last final thoughts, Sean, that you'd like to share.
Yeah, just two things. One, I would encourage people to check out the series we wrote about this, and I just dropped a link in the chat. And if you have questions or interested in what we found about your state, please email me and encourage everybody to buy John's book because it's.
Well, I was gonna encourage them to do the same, or if they don't want to buy it, you can read Catherine Schultz's New Yorker profile, which writes about the book a lot better than I could ever write about the book. So I encourage you to read it. And I'll just say, having talked for the last 75 minutes, a big thank you to Les and Stop Predatory Gambling and to Sean for taking the time and for bringing us together to talk about this issue that, as we've discussed, doesn't always get the attention that it should.
And I also briefly want to recognize Kathy Best, who joined us today. She's the director of the Howard Center at the University of Maryland, who helped oversee the entire Lottery Series project. And we're glad to have her with us today and appreciate her willingness to take this project on. So thank you to Kathy as well.
Yes.
All right. Thank you, everybody. We'll be sending out a recording of this webinar at some point over the next few days once it's completed. And we look for future events of this nature. So thank you all.
Thank you very much. See you all.
Everyone.